Sasakawa and Elie Wiesel founded Forum 2000 for a purpose.
We have to use the past to not becoming our children's future.
Thank you very much. I am honored to be here, and I want to thank President Havel for convening another extraordinary gathering of Forum 2000.
So those people, their peace, think more seriously, and we should develop new ideas, and then important is implementation.
Dámy a pánové, vážení přítomní, já vás co nejsrdečněji vítám na konferenci Forum 2000.
The world is upside down. How should we put it back together? Are we able to act responsibly? Can we work together, play by the rules, and restore solidarity? Let's use this crisis as an opportunity. A new world emerging? Watch the online Forum 2000 conference, October 12th to 14th.
Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to this public session on Asia, the new center of the global battle of ideas of Day 2 of this year's Forum 2000. My name is Maiko Ichihara, Associate Professor of Hitotsubashi University, Japan, and visiting scholar at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in the United States. It is my honor to be a part of this year's Forum 2000 and to moderate this panel hosted by Forum 2000's Information Center for Democracy and Human Rights in China. This panel explores international order in the age of Asia's rise. Liberal international order has been under a serious pressure with a plethora of issues in democratic countries, from populism, polarization, disinformation, nativism, and unilateralism, just to name but a few. While such issues have weakened the influence of Western democracies, Asia has been moving to the central stage of global politics, mainly with rising influence of China and heightened US-China rivalry. However, Asia is at the same time a region where a number of fault lines exist, which include what we can categorize as issues related to territory over maritime territories in East and South China Sea, and land territories between India and China, and in Taiwan, in the Taiwan Strait and the Korean Peninsula. This is also a region where both democracies and authoritarian countries exist, and is a home to two of the countries with world's most egregious human rights violations, North Korea and China. What can we expect from Asia's more prominent role on the global stage? Are we witnessing the beginning of a new Cold War? To explore such a macro issue of international order, we are honored to have three distinguished speakers in this session. Our first speaker is Professor Qiang, founder of China Digital Times and professor of UC Berkeley School of Information. Our second speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Economy, Senior Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution in the US. And our third speaker is Ambassador Neelam, Director of Gateway House India, and a former Indian ambassador to Denmark and Ivory Coast with concurrent accreditation to Niger, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. I will ask each of the speakers a few rounds of questions. Please keep your answers short and in 3 to 4 minutes each. Speakers are always welcome to jump in to comment on each other's remarks anytime. Audience is also welcome to raise questions using the Slido function. I will pick up questions from the audience in the final 10 minutes or so of the session. So I'd like to start with you, Professor Xiao. Democratic countries are suffering from various domestic issues around the world, and this has led to a serious state of domestic affairs. For example, in the United States, in a recent TV debate of presidential candidate, it was pretty messy, and the White House became a quasi-epicenter of coronavirus. And there is an increase of usage or the justification of usage of violence in the country. And in a recent piece, Atlantic Council's Fredley Kemp argues that CCP's media has been issuing statements that Western democracies are out of order while China has been maintaining political stability. So, Professor Xiao, how does China perceive the rise of issues in democratic countries? Are they trying to utilize these issues, and if so, how? Over to you.
Sure. Thank you for this opportunity and this important question. The question about how China, in this case, we're talking about Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party leadership, how do they view the rise of nationalism, popularism, and variety of challenges and happening in the Western countries, from the United States to many parts of Europe. Certainly, they view that's the weakness of the open society. They see how those rising movements creating problems in the countries who has rule of law, democratic governance, and election, and very well-established market economy. Actually, starting from 2008, Chinese leadership has been viewing that the rise of China's economic strengths giving them a lot of confidence about their own autocratic system actually has some comparative advantage over open societies. Something we didn't think about that before. Let me just add two more points. That we always thought globalization is a force to opening up closer societies such as China. We always thought that information and communication technologies will bring the freedom of information and expanding the freedom of expression and even freedom of association that to top over any authoritarian rule. That was a digital promise we were all hoped for. We didn't see in the past 10 years that both the globalization, economic globalization, and the information technology actually, in the case of China, has helped the Chinese Communist Party strengthening its rule, not only domestically more repressive to its own people, but much more aggressively in the global stage. And this is the challenge we're facing now.
Thank you very much. So that's a very wonderful starting point. I think, we in this first round of questions, I want to ask you about the viewpoints of Asian giants, which means China and India. And so relatedly, I would like to ask the next question to Dr. Elizabeth Economy. China has been increasingly becoming aggressive in terms of its behavior, especially externally. It has been sending jets into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, killing a dozen Indian soldiers, sinking a Vietnamese fishing vessel, and entering into the maritime territory of Japan's Senkaku Island area. And notoriously, China enacted the Hong Kong security law in a hasty manner. And with this law, it has been killing freedom and human rights in Hong Kong. So, in a recent national interest piece, it argued that China has been taking aggressive measures externally to avert domestic public's eyes, given given the rise of criticism against China's governance. Dr. Elizabeth Economy, do you agree with that? What do you think is China's motivations behind these aggressive behaviors?
Thanks so much, Maiko. It's really great to be here and have the opportunity to talk about China and Asia more broadly with you and Ambassador Deo and also Professor Xiao. So I think, look, when Xi Jinping first came to power at the end of 2012, he called for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And that really was about reclaiming a degree of centrality for China on the global stage. And when I think about the past 8 years since he's been in power and what we've seen emanating from China, I tend to think about Chinese foreign policy in 3 buckets. The first is around the sovereignty issues, right, where we've seen China move from what I would call staking claims around sovereignty to realizing them. The second would be the spread of Chinese political and economic and security influence, primarily through the Belt and Road Initiative. And the third would be China's efforts to reshape global norms and values in international institutions and arrangements in ways that will make them align more closely with those of China. And what you've described in terms of Chinese aggressive behavior toward Taiwan and India, Vietnam, Japan, I think really falls largely in the first bucket, which is asserting Chinese sovereignty claims, trying to make progress on border disputes. And I think for Xi Jinping, there cannot be a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation unless China is unified. So unless these territorial claims, these sovereignty claims are resolved. I would put Hong Kong a little bit aside because, technically speaking, Beijing's sovereignty over Hong Kong is recognized in international law. And I think here that basically the motivation on the part of Beijing, the understanding was that one country, two systems was not working to the benefit of the mainland, that the democracy activists were growing in strength, both in terms of their number and in terms of their international support, and that the Hong Kong government was unable to manage the situation. And Beijing was no longer interested in having this, voice of democracy, right? This, city of Chinese people actively demonstrating for greater democracy, when it's sitting on top of 1 billion people who are not able to enjoy those same rights. So I think it's a little bit different. But I think in terms of Xi's strategy with regard to the other nations, as you described, Beijing, uses military power. We saw the border clashes with India, the sinking of the Vietnamese boat, et cetera. And it uses economic leverage as well, right? So cutting tourism to Taiwan, banning banana sales from the Philippines, and it tries to ensure that the international community recognizes Chinese sovereignty claims. So, punishing multinationals if they recognize Taiwan as a separate entity. I think my greatest concern right now is really around Taiwan and the positive attention that the nation has received for its handling of the coronavirus, the enhanced relations with the United States, Taiwan's welcoming of Hong Kong refugees, Taiwan's landslide victory. I think all of these things put a lot of pressure on the government in the mainland because, again, Taiwan is so successful, as a thriving democracy with a significant Chinese population. In the end, I would say we've watched, I don't think that this type of assertive action is anything new. We've watched this. It's been decades, where China has been assertive. And as I think Xiao suggested, it intensified around 2008 and 2010 when China began to feel that it had greater leverage and power. And certainly Xi Jinping, I think, has accelerated it even more. And again, yes, I do think that the COVID-19, the slowing of the Chinese economy, does make China look toward nationalism to try to find an alternative source of legitimacy. But I think this is a deeply felt desire and longstanding policy, especially with Xi Jinping, to make progress on reclaiming sovereignty. So whether or not China is successful economically or not, I expect that we're going to continue to see these types of aggressive actions from China.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elizabeth Economy. So that's a very gloomy, actually scenario that it's likely to continue. China's aggressive behavior, and that's going to be also the case toward India, continuously. So next, I would like to ask a question to Ambassador Neelam Dio. Anti-China sentiment has been on the rise in India as India-China relations deteriorates. And a recent Quad meeting in Tokyo this month seems to have symbolized a cooperation of the 4 democratic countries, namely Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, against authoritarian China. These 4 countries underscores the common values of democracy, seemingly, from my point of view, to emphasize the sense of community among them. On the other hand, the Indian government has been implementing various illiberal measures domestically and does not seem to have embedded democratic values in itself. So what is democracy for India, Indian diplomacy? Does the Indian government perceive the current global affairs as democracy versus authoritarianism or something else? Ambassador Neelam Dio, over to you.
So thank you. I want to make a couple of points. One is that, of course, anti-China sentiment in India has risen very sharply after the armed incursions into the Western boundary over the summer. There have been incursions in the past, and it has taken time to resolve those issues. In some cases, the Chinese forces did not withdraw. In others, they did. But this has been unprecedented in its scope, in its depth, and therefore there is a strong belief that these are not just incursions taken by border forces, but by the highest level of government in China. So Government of India has, in response, taken some economic actions to constrain Chinese investment in what it regards as areas that impinge on our national security, including excluding Chinese companies from some projects, especially those undertaken by Government of India enterprises. And it has banned about 200 social media apps, most prominently starting with TikTok, WeChat, etc. In the meanwhile, of course, you see that India has been leaning more towards the West, particularly the United States, with which it has signed some security-related agreements. But this process had begun much earlier, and still dependent and very friendly with Russia for its existing weapon systems. India is quite close to Vietnam. So the question of democracies and non-democracies is always a more difficult, more complicated issue to make binary as between democracy and authoritarianism. Coming to the Quad, India sees the Quad as a group of democracies coming together to preserve the existing order, both the geopolitical, geosecurity, and geoeconomic. So it feels that it is being threatened by Chinese actions against India, where the sovereignty issues and use of force issue has come in the South China Sea, where there is a use of force, and again, challenges to sovereignty disputes with all the ASEAN countries. There is the differences with Japan, which have been mentioned already, and with Australia. So all the Quad partners, so to speak, have had issues with China. At the same time, India sees the Quad as a potential for coming together on geoeconomic issues, which also have either been aggravated or international multilateral organizations which have been gamed by China. So, for instance, there is an initiative on the relocation of supply lines There is an initiative for sustainable infrastructure, which can easily be seen, if you wish, to be set against the Belt and Road Initiative. And then there are the post-pandemic dialogue, which has already begun with several countries, including New Zealand, South Korea. So I want to say that India has a broader definition. And as to its own positioning, India is committed to multipolarity and to multilateralism. It supports the global order, fairly close to the position of Japan, but it's not willing to enter into alliances in the way that Australia or Japan already have the United States. So although India has moved away from non-alignment, it says it looks for convergences of interests, and perhaps because it wants to preserve some level of strategic autonomy. I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Well, that's a fascinating point. As Ambassador said, Quad in India especially has been trying to utilize this Quad and other schemes for the maintenance of status quo. And this, I think, Ambassador sort of implied that this was a response to China's behaviors of, behaviors to try to change the international order. China has been indeed taking a number of problematic measures to deteriorate sentiment toward the country, which include election meddling, violation of UK-China joint declaration, the security issues of Huawei, and so forth. But at the same time, I want to connect this point to a question, next round of question, and a question about international affairs and policies. And the first question being addressed to Professor Qiang. While there are those attempts to maintain the international order, maintain the status quo in response to China's moves, being in the election year in the United States, Trump has been utilizing the anti-China card, seeking to get re-elected, which seems to have helped worsen American sentiment toward China. And together with China's moves, anti-China sentiment is at a historic high point internationally, according to a recent Pew Research Center survey. So my question for Professor Qiang is, do you think the world has entered or will enter the era of the new Cold War? And why do you think so, or why do you not think so? Over to you.
Okay, let me try to give a little bit longer answer on this question. Right? The longer answer is we have to look at how China has been developed in the past few decades. And when I was talking on the last question, I mentioned that the globalization, economic globalization, and the rise of information and communication technology actually it served both opening up Chinese society, and now we can see clearly 40 years later or 30 years later, strengthened the Chinese Communist Party's ruling in China. I want to emphasize this point because we cannot live in last World War, sort of the self-satisfactory of freedom and democracy is prevailing, and authoritarian regime is inevitably failing. But if now we look at the comparative somewhat strength that Chinese authoritarian regime gathered through the past decades, and what they have learned, not more than that, what they are building, which is a digital authoritarian surveillance state in the past decade, which really something new, that giving the Chinese Communist Party a new strength. At international level, they are fighting at an international stage to determine global technology standards, in addition to all the other assertive moves that Dr. Economy just listed. And domestically, the Chinese companies are creative, innovative, competitive. Now they are exporting 5G technology, right? And also like facial recognition. Broad. Let's talk about one more thing that right now we're going through, pandemic. Yes, it is true that it was the inherent Chinese authoritarian regime, that non-transparency, the error of the system made this pandemic worldwide. But we cannot be blind to see China now actually effectively controlled the epidemics. Because controlling epidemics has always required monitoring the population, understand and limit the spread of disease by close control of society and population. And the Chinese authoritarian regime has done exactly so, very effectively, including using all the surveillance technologies, including using their so-called grid management, those stability management systems that authoritarian regime put it on its own society. But this time, this intrusive surveillance actually helped Chinese government control the spread of disease. It turned out the authoritarian regime had some advantage. This is not simply say only the Chinese government control the disease. There's South Korean, there's Taiwan, there's other societies has done a good job while maintaining the societies open and free. But in the zone of looking at the asymmetrical power constructed by the surveillance capital and operated in secrecy beyond the confrontation of accountability, this is an authoritarian model we Democrats reject. But also we have to recognize this is a power that giving the current Chinese Communist Party some strengths. Let me add one more point before I get to answer your question directly. Another point is we have to also facing the rise of the nationalism inside of China. That's the Chinese Communist Party seeking for its legitimacy foundation. That is what Chinese new leader, the biggest dictator in the world now, Xi Jinping's so-called China dream, which is, in his own word, the combination of the individual pursuit of happiness, but depends on the national greatness, the state, the greatness of the state, as Dr. Economy just said, about the rejuvenization of Chinese civilization. That is not that new. That is a fascist idea. That individual is actually, the well-being is actually dependent on the greatness of the state. And if that's the case, if the China's authoritarian regime are holding some competitive advantage right now, whether it's a supply chain that become the capacity of producing the goods, whether it's the in the globalization time, whether it's the sort of advance of the surveillance technology to control the society. Now, this rising of the nationalism and the potential expansion to the world, giving us a new context of, I don't want to call it a second Cold War yet, but it's certainly providing no less challenge than the last Cold War between the US-led Western camp and the Soviet Union's Eastern camp. In this case, now we're talking about the anti-China sentiments around the world, talking about a U.S. election and President Trump's China policy, etc. I can only say, from the Chinese authoritarian ruler point of view, which is Xi Jinping, he welcomed this conflict between the China and the West, between the China and the United States, because it helps him to strengthen the power at home. This, unfortunately, is a reality. That while the world pushing back on China, its aggressive behavior in the international stage, at the same time helped the current Chinese leader that to further galvanizing the nationalism within the country, supporting its ruling power.
Thank you very much, Xiao. That's a wonderful point. Well, I think well, I want to ask well, Dr. Elizabeth Economy as well. Well, whether you agree with Xiao Zhan's point that the rise of nationalism is going to lead to a new Cold War, and Xi Jinping is ready to accept it, and also, from the opposite side's point of view. But well, at the same time, I want to ask you that well, as I said, the anti-China sentiment has been on the rise, especially in Western democracies. But at the same time, for Asian countries such as Japan, South Korea, and Southeast Asia although they are cautious about China's moves, but at the same time, they are seeking the way to maintain the liberal international order by not stimulating China too much, not causing anti-China sort of, approach too much. So, well, I want to ask you, this question as well. How should the West approach Asia when there is a discrepancy between the gap between West and Asia in terms of their viewpoints about China?
Thank you. And so I'll make one quick comment about Xiao Zhang at the end of my remarks, but just let me start off with the question you just asked me. So I agree that in general, countries in Asia are not interested in being forced to choose between the United States and China. But I do think we've seen a surprising amount of agreement and accord between many of the sort of larger Asian countries and the West. And so you can, if you look at sort of the Pew poll, recent Pew poll that came out that sort of looked at many countries' advanced economies and sort of their sentiment toward China. Certainly European countries, many of them were off the charts in terms of their anti-China sentiment, but so too South Korea, had negative impression of China at 75%. Australia was at 81%. Japan was at 86%. Funny enough, the U.S. was lower than all of them and still high at 73%. But I do think that it would be a mistake to believe that Asian countries are not enormously concerned and don't have a degree of fairly negative sentiment toward China. And if you look at countries, for example, that barred Huawei from their telecommunications infrastructure, Japan and Australia actually barred Huawei before the United States did. And Japan has certainly emerged as a leader in Asia in terms of forging partnerships with other democracies to counter Chinese influence, as the ambassador, I think, was discussing earlier. You have an Asia-Africa corridor with India and Japan, the Quad. You have the Blue Dot Network with U.S., Australia, and Japan, a new effort among Australia, Japan, and India on supply chain resiliency. And I think you also have some interesting civil society relationships emerging. For example, among Thailand, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and democracy activists and what they're calling this milk tea alliance. I think within ASEAN, it's one thing, I guess, with the major powers. Within ASEAN, there's a lot of variability. Everything from Vietnam, which has developed a very strong military-to-military relationship with the United States, also has banned Huawei, to Laos, which is, of course, very much more in China's orbit. And I think when asked to choose between the United States and China, as another recent study has done, many of the countries in ASEAN, they split pretty significantly. So, Singapore, the Philippines, Vietnam, choose the U.S. You've got Laos, Brunei, Myanmar, Malaysia, choosing China. And in between, much more split, closer to 50-50, interestingly, you have Thailand, Indonesia, and even Cambodia, which I think is very interesting. Basically, what comes out of all of that is that everybody wants the European Union and Japan to play a stronger role in the region. And of course, there's still a lot of sentiment about ASEAN finding its own way, its own path, and ASEAN centrality and autonomy. Overall, I guess I would say I think countries in Asia are more likely to talk softly in expressing their concerns about China, but it is important to watch what they're doing on the ground. As far as Xiao Jiang's last point about sort of the emerging coalition of countries and the fact that Xi Jinping actually welcomes all of this pushback, I might characterize it slightly differently, which is to say, I think it's easy for Xi and for China, the Chinese leadership, to push back against the United States and to use that to rally nationalist sentiment, because there's always been the argument the United States is simply trying to contain China. Even when it was completely not true, you would find that argument in the Chinese media and among more hawkish and conservative parts of the Chinese academy. Today, there's more of an element of truth given the Trump administration. I think Xi Jinping finds it harder, and I think there is more pushback within China, certainly among elite circles, against sort of this hard wolf warrior diplomacy type of approach when you start to look at many other countries in Europe and Japan, South Korea. So I think once you start engaging a much wider range of countries, I think then it becomes less plausible that this is just about the United States trying to contain China when you have many more voices speaking out. I think the real danger point, and I'll stop here, will be when and if a broader group of developing economies and developing democracies, right, begin to challenge China. And I think then you'll really find Xi Jinping placed in a very difficult position to argue that what he's doing, either domestically or on the, domestically with regard, for example, to Xinjiang, but also on the foreign policy front, he'll find it much more difficult to defend that against his critics. Thanks.
Oh. Hello.
Looks like Maiko is maybe frozen.
Yeah, that's... Maiko?
So, the ambassador, you want to?
Maybe I'll just come in to
well, maybe
say that I want to I'm thankful for Dr. Economy's sort of a recategorization of my overly broad statement. I think she got a very important point.
So I actually would challenge that a little bit, because I think Europe has had a much harder time actually being more explicit. It's only in the last couple of months that Germany, France, the European Union have come out with an Indo-Pacific strategy. And it's not such a long time ago that the US president was talking about how, President Xi was his best friend, how well he was handling the coronavirus epidemic, etc. So I actually find that developing countries have been able to come forward more. India, certainly, because of our specific problems with China, which refuses to even discuss demarcating the border, but also countries like Malaysia, Myanmar, which renegotiated projects that they had been forced to undertake in the Belt and Road Initiative and actually brought the costs down a great deal. ASEAN has, of course, been unhappy, but I'm not sure it's unhappier than the China plus 17 grouping in Europe, where some of the members of this grouping actually prevented the European Union from even passing a resolution on the human rights situation in China. I think it's a more complex question of how much a country is able to resist, and including Australia, which till a year was not actually taking on these issues. And that has a lot to do with the economic interdependence and how much the globalization and the supply chains all centered around China actually have made governments hesitate. So yes, populations, as they were polled by the Pew Research Organization, showed a lot of antipathy, but governments much less than their people.
And, I think you're pointing to an important, making an important point in the sense that we've seen evolution, right? And so, for example, Europe has, over the past year and a half to two, become much stronger in its approach to China. Its characterization of China as a systemic rival is fairly radically different from how it was looking at China a number of years ago. If you start to look, for example, the countries that have signed on to the resolution criticizing China on Xinjiang, right, that number has increased by, at least 10 to 15 over the past just year. The number of countries that have moved to ban Huawei from their infrastructure also has increased over the past year. And I have to say, much as I am loath to give too much credit to the Trump administration, I think that a lot of that has to do with not President Trump himself, but his administration. And here I'll just say, I think it's important to distinguish between President Trump and his approach to China, his comments about Xi Jinping as his best friend, and all these things, and then what his administration is doing, because his administration is much more multilateral and internationalist than President Trump is. And so I want to make that point because I think it's important to distinguish. In many respects, the U.S. has two very different foreign policies underway when it comes to China.
Yeah. I agree with you, but I do want to I just want to make one small point clear, which is that Asia is very troubled, and we feel the weight of China much more, perhaps, than Europe has in the past. But you're absolutely right that Europe has evolved.
Right. I agree that Asia is in a different situation because, one, they are taking the opportunity of economic rise of China, that the China and India and two other engines of the economic growth in the past decades. So there's an enormous benefit that they align with China in many ways. But also that China has been historically until now a untrustworthy power that in the region. It has issues with practically every countries around its border, be India and Japan and so Vietnam. So this untrustworthiness is deeply rooted. And now giving is a Communist Party's authoritarian power, which is not accountable to its own people, cannot change the nature of that untrustworthy relationship. So the more China grows stronger, and there's more tension in a sense between its neighbors, although there's also that economically and geopolitically there's other a certain benefit from the region. So that's put Asia in a very South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia in a very different place than say United States is a dominant power, which has a lot of concerns, but but China is changing the world order, or the Europe, which kind of like trying to take an advantage between the rival between the United States and China, until it's realized this is not about a simple geopolitical interest, but is a fundamental sort of camp of that China is a rising authoritarian model, which I don't think European countries can agree with. So they start to sense that threat, but still remotely.
Yeah. Sorry, let me interrupt you. And thank you so much for continuing the discussion. I lost the internet connection, and now I'm using my phone to come back here. Well, I'm not sure if Ambassador Neelam Dio had another chance to talk for the second round, but I think it's about time that we have to wrap up. Well, I'm sorry I lost access to the question as well, so I cannot pick up the question, and I really apologize about that. So, well, thank you very much for this wonderful, very wonderful discussion in here. I think, although I missed the final or some minutes, emphasized in the session. One is that pandemic or Trump are not variables, and there has been the strengthening of the Communist Party in China, even before then, and also China's aggressive behavior has been there since Xi Jinping.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question. Sure.
Yeah, I think Elizabeth, would you do that?
Okay, so this is addressing my point. Thanks for everybody. And if we use China technology or Zoom, probably better quality, but that's also a problem, right? I'll leave that for everybody else.
A big problem of trust. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.